Hey, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on social emotional learning and school growth models. I know we are going to continue to have some folks joining, but I like to get started right at 11 so we can pack in all of the goodness into the webinar that we have planned for you today. So just to give a little bit of framing, and then I'll turn it over very quickly to our esteemed panelists. We are here today to talk about two very important issues that in this set of studies has come together. And it's the issue of understanding school impact on student outcomes more generally through a growth model, which the core districts have innovated around for many years, and also how to apply some of the learning from understanding school impact and student outcomes from academic metrics into an emerging realm of measurement, which is social emotional learning. The core districts have measured social emotional learning for some time, and in new research, we are now learning how we can apply a growth model to the social emotional learning metrics. So we're really excited to talk with you about this intersection today. So what you'll expect in the hour that we have together is first, Rick Miller and Dave Calhoun from the core districts will give a background on CORE's work, their multiple measures approach, and how they chose and why to measure social emotional learning. I'll talk about our broad program of work on social emotional learning here at PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education, and how we're helping to advance learning around their measures in SEL. Sean McLaughlin from Education Analytics, CORE's analytics partner, will talk about more broadly how a growth model works and why it matters. Hans Fricke from PACE will share the results of our new research on social emotional learning growth model, and then we'll have time for reflections from folks in the field in school districts who are really working to use social emotional learning data and ideas, but also school growth metrics through the Core Data Collaborative. And we'll leave ample time for questions and answers, which you can either post into the Q&A box, or we'll have time at the end for more deliberate Q&A from any of the panelists. So please keep note of the types of questions and reflections you'd like to share. Without further ado, I will hand it over to our first speakers, Rick Miller.
Great, thanks, Heather. Just I'll wave. This is me, Rick. We're in a big thing, and we're here in Wisconsin with our partners from Education Analytics. So appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to everyone. So let me tell you a little bit about CORE. First, I think most probably know, but just to be so that everyone know that CORE is a collaborative of 8 large districts in California, representing over 1 million students, 56,000 educators, and 1,800 or so schools. So the basic idea about CORE was that we felt like districts could learn from each other and work together for the greater good. We didn't need to compete as much as just get better together, and that sort of was the genesis and continues to be our driving force today. As part of CORE's work, we've also created a data system to share information to actually learn from each other. We think data is a critical part of how you learn, and also felt that while CORE collaborates around certain areas that I'll talk about, that this notion of data sharing and learning from each other shouldn't be kept to just these 8 districts, but should be about anyone. We've opened it up to any LEA in the state that wants to join. And as you can see, as a result, we have a significant number of LEAs and counties and districts that have joined our collaborative, representing over 2 million students, 80 plus districts, and 100,000 teachers. Not all of these actually do our SEL survey, just a part of those. We'll talk about that a little later for what those districts are. But this is sort of all our data sharing, where we do most everything sort of the CalPEDS data system has, plus some additional information. We have a culture climate survey and SEL survey, and we do some advanced analytics in terms of preparation for high school out of middle school and readiness for college and high school. And so those are some additional parts of the data system that we provide to everyone. So we've sort of been through 3 phases that are sort of briefly worth noting from a core perspective of the process today. The first was that just initial area of us getting together and collaborating and talking to each other, which had limited value, but really built relationships, I would argue, at the beginning. Then our move was, as many of you know, we got a waiver from the federal government around No Child Left Behind, which allowed us to build a new accountability model. And it is out of that idea that came our SEL work. The critical thing was this waiver came in the heart of NCLB when accountability was very much being used as a hammer. to try to get schools to change that was in an ineffective way. And our thinking and our waiver submission was very much changing the whole idea of what accounting is for, and really trying to make it about what we think matters, measures that we think are important, and how we can, as a collective, pay attention to them. We often will talk about using data as a flashlight, not as a hammer, and how we can make that move. And in that spirit, we thought it was critically important to include social emotional learning as part of that, because it was something we knew mattered, we knew schools cared about, and we wanted to include it in the work. And so we were, there were states all across the country that received a waiver from the NCLB. We were the only set of districts in the country that did it, and I think it's not coincidental that the only accountability that was developed by districts use SEL measures, because I think the closer you get to the classroom, the more you recognize that these matter, and it's something we do want to pay attention to. Then the 3.0 version of CORE, which we're doing now, is sort of post-waiver, is really focusing on improvement science and this notion of how we can become learning organizations and working with our districts to think differently about, through an equity lens, about how we can actually learn and get better together, and actually using improvement science as sort of a guide of our work. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. So just to give you an idea, sort of a quick walkthrough of our SEL work. So we had the waiver, which I spoke of, and then we created this SEL survey, which we actually created on. We worked with experts in the field at the time to sort of think about what the right questions were, and then we got the results in. We've done some streamlining of the data as a result since. We've piloted it, got it out, and you sort of see the timeline that brought us today, where now we have what I like to say is the largest survey of SEL constructs in the galaxy, because no one has as many kids as we do in it. All right, so we can go to the next one. Finally, just again, this is the list of the districts that are part of it. You'll see most of the core districts, including also San Bernardino, Palm Springs, and Corona Norco. I'm particularly excited that Jim Pfeffer and Jennifer are here today, Jennifer from Corona Norco and Jim from Palm Springs, to actually talk to us about, from a district perspective, how they're using this data and why they find it impactful from their perspective, and I appreciate them being here. And then some 15 to 20 additional districts are piloting. So from our perspective also, SEL is a huge bucket. There's lots of things that can go into a SEL. We spent a lot of time thinking about the constructs that we thought were most important from our perspective years ago. And these 4 areas sort of jumped out of us as sort of worth noting and worth paying attention to. So self-management, the ability to regulate one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, social awareness, ability to take a perspective and empathize with others, growth mindset, I think was probably the most talked about, which is the notion of building your own ability you can grow and you can get smarter. And then the final, the notion of self-efficacy and beliefs in one's ability to succeed in achieving the outcome or goal. And all you'll see is our results show that all 4 of these are unique constructs. We can actually look at them differently and sort of look at our progress along them, and all 4 matter independently. So finally, our SEL data for continuous improvement, in concert with district schools and school teams, are tracking schools' progress over time. Some folks are creating inputting school plans, working with their SIPSA, so using this data locally to think through what they look at as high quality, and then trying to find actually sort of positive places where we're having some good progress, where our results are higher than you would expect, and then trying to learn from those folks as we can sort of, then share that learning across our districts and across our entire state, ideally. So with that, I think that's my final slide, and I think we're going to turn over back to Heather at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. And I'll encourage all of the folks that are on the line to think about any questions that you have for Rick and for Dave about the core work, because they'll be available to answer any of those as well. So as Rick said, their measures of social emotional learning are the largest in the galaxy. And when any new metric is introduced, there's a lot of research work that has to be done to understand whether these measures are valid and reliable, how they relate to other outcomes that we care about, how schools and districts or states really can and should use those measures. And so I'm in a very whirlwind tour going to go over the quite large body of research that we and our partners have been accumulating over the past few years to try to begin to answer those questions. And I highly encourage folks that are interested in SEL measurement to go to our website. I'll put the link, we'll make sure that the link gets to everyone who registered, and we'll also paste it here in the Q&A box. We have lots of work that I think it's useful to dig into if you're considering using these measures in any kind of capacity. But the first set of questions that we wanted to answer were really basic questions about measurement. How should these scores on the SEL survey be calculated and reported? Is there any kind of bias in how students answer the questions? Because if there is, then that's something that from a measurement perspective, we really need to address. So this work has helped us both eliminate some questions and introduce new questions, but also to get really smart about how we report the scores. For example, using scales metrics instead of using raw scores, which eliminates, strengthens the instrument and eliminates some of the sources of bias that have existed in the instrument. The second set of questions that we are working on are related to the first. Next. And so it's more types of questions about consistency across administration and respondents, but really also all building toward the idea that the survey itself needs to be a continually improving instrument. The core districts and PACE and education analytics have come to the idea of SEL measurement that this whole endeavor is an experiment of sorts. And we very much need to make sure that anything we learn from the research is fed back into a process where the instrument is improved, and those improvements can allow for use across time. The third set of questions that we're interested in are about how SEL is related to other things we care about. So SEL, I think our research and other research has shown that it's important on a dimension all its own, and we honor that and we respect that, but also is a lot of theory and now evidence showing that student social emotional learning is directly related to other outcomes like school attendance or like their academic outcomes. And so we wanted to show that, and also now we're working on some work to understand not just that there's a correlation, but is there a causal impact? Or can we get closer to a causal impact? So if schools are able to improve social emotional learning, does that then lead to an improvement in academics and other outcomes that we care about? And so this brings us to the final set of questions that we're working on, and which the study today will be a part of, is how can educators within districts, schools, and policymakers, even at the state level, use these measures to change outcomes for kids? At the end of the day, that's what all of this is about. And so we have a number of different studies looking at different pieces of this. So we have qualitative work that digs into how educators can use the SEL measures to improve schools and how they do. So asking people what they do in response to this, what they see on these surveys and in their dashboards to improve outcomes for kids. What's the relationship between school culture and climate and social emotional learning, and how can culture and climate be used as a mechanism to improve student social emotional outcomes? And we're also looking at the distinct and important contributions from a measurement perspective of teachers and schools on student social emotional learning. And the paper that we'll be talking about today is really focusing on this school piece. How can we observe schools impacting student social emotional learning? And when we think about being able to measure that impact, can we do it, and what can we learn from that approach? So with that and that very broad sweep to orient you to our larger body of research, we're going to pass on to Sean, who's going to give a bit of a primer about growth models, what they are, why they're important.
Thank you very much, Heather. Has been noted, a lot of those questions have to do with thinking about adding this growth lens to SEL data. So a lot of the work education analytics has done over the years is about the academic space when it comes to growth models. And in that space, a statistical growth model, or value-added model is another word for this, is a statistical approach to measuring the effect that the school has on students' academic growth from one year to the next. So in this space in SEL, what we're thinking about, how can we apply that methodology to a measure of a student's growth in SEL from one year to the next, figure out what is the effect a school has on that. So what I'm about to do is show a little bit more background and then some conceptual slides to kind of get at our approach of how we're thinking about applying a growth model, value-added model approach to SEL rather than academic space. One of the things we like to think about is this power of two different measures, two lenses to the same kind of data. If we think about SEL levels on one side and then growth on the other, there's a few different differences between those. On the one hand, you can think about SEL levels as measuring a student's social emotional learning at a single point in time, but with growth, we're thinking about longitudinal data for a student. In the SEL levels, we're not necessarily factoring in the background characteristics of students, but in the growth mindset, if we're thinking about figuring out what the school is doing, what the educators are doing, we may want to factor in the background characteristics of students that are outside of the control of the educators. One of the main outcomes in the SEL levels would be the ability to compare a student's SEL to other students. But in growth, what we're thinking about is the impact of schools or the education system on SEL itself. And our pitch here with these power of two measures is thinking that you get a more complete picture of SEL by looking at both the SEL level, but also the growth or the impact of schools on that SEL. So what I'm about to do is give a conceptual introduction to how we take SEL data and come up with an SEL growth metric. The first step conceptual would be after the survey is complete, collect all these student scale score data on SEL from core. What we do with that information is determine the average growth from one year to the next for each subject and grade for students' SEL outcomes, and then figure out if there are demographic adjustments or differences in the amount of growth that different demographic groups experience from one year to the next. What we then do with that is determine a statistical prediction for each student customized to their starting point and their characteristics. So this is visualized here. We have a starting scale score from the previous year for a student, and we have a prediction for the current year, end of year, for what they would achieve in SEL given their starting point, and then an average amount of growth that similar students would achieve from our data set. We also might make adjustments for student level characteristics or school level characteristics that are beyond the control of the school to influence. And at the end, we would have that predicted score, that outcome that we think is a reasonable prediction of how a student would achieve at the end of the year when it comes to an SEL scale score. And don't write these specific numbers down because these are just examples rather than actual findings that we have from the data. We would be making different adjustments each year, knowing that those differences in scales may change. We would calculate this each year for each grade and subject. So for a growth model, how it works, the next step would be to figure out if each student ended up having a higher SEL scale score at the end of the year than their predicted outcome or a lower than we predicted. On the left side, we have a student with a certain predicted score based on the starting point and characteristics. In this case, we might find that this student's actual score on SEL was 5 points higher than the prediction for similar students. On the right side, we have a different student with their own customized prediction. That student might not meet that prediction by 4 scale score points in this example. Next, what we would do, or this is actually more examples, just to show that if we find, for example, that students with high prior year SEL scores tend to not grow as much from one year to the next, that would be built into the predictions that we would make. There might be some adjustments in the scale, measurement error, et cetera. Those could come into play. So just to note that at each different level, there's going to be a prediction that's based on all that data we have from across the core data set that goes into those predictions for students. And even if a student was high on the scale, they could still exceed that prediction or not, or if they were low on the scale, they could not or exceed those predictions as well. Next, what we do is we aggregate that together. This example is a school level example where we would take all the students in a school and determine if the students on average tended to exceed or not meet those predictions and by how much. In this example on the left in school A, we might calculate all that and find out that on average students tended to score 3 points higher on the SEL scale at the end of the year than we would have predicted. That would be an example of an above average SEL growth outcome for that school. In the other example here on school B, we might find that on average students did not meet those predictions by a little less than 1 point there. That would be a below average SEL growth outcome for that school. And finally, what we would do is we would convert it to some sort of common scale for comparability across schools. In this example, it's a 0 to 6 scale shown here. This is a a scale that we've used from time to time when it comes to the academic growth. So it's an example here we might use for SEL here. So you can see that here we'd be able to show schools that had lower growth, about average growth, or higher impact on growth for their students' SEL outcomes. I suppose that's the last slide there for that conceptual example of growth. And as always, if there's questions that are coming up, please do add those and we can come back to those at the end.
All right, thank you, Sean. So now I'm going to talk about more like what we actually found when we try to apply these types of models to socio-emotional learning. And the research that I'll be talking about was a joint project with a lot of collaborators, including Heather Hoff at Pace, Susanna Loeb at Brown University, and Robert Meyer, Andrew Rice, Libby Peer, and many others at Education Analytics. So it was a very collaborative project. As we've seen and heard, that growth models is a very common way of measuring the impact of schools on how students develop from one year to the next in academic outcomes, such as test scores. And also Rick told us a lot about like how school districts and states are more and more interested in measuring SEL as a more holistic way of approaching student success and school quality. However, there's not that much known yet of whether we can actually use these types of value-added models to understand the contribution of schools on growth in SEL. Last year, we published one paper through PACE that had looked at this question, and we found that there were meaningful differences between schools and how they contribute to growth. And I'm gonna talk about a little bit more what we think meaningful means, or why we would want differences between schools, because differences, if we wouldn't find any differences in how schools contribute to growth in SEL, then that would mean that either schools don't contribute to it, or that all of the schools contribute in the same way, which suggests that there isn't much variation that could be used as a policy lever for practice to understand how schools are doing better than some others. So that's why we want differences between schools. However, in that study, there was some open questions about whether this is actually the impact of the school or other factors that we don't really observe. So in this study that I'll talk about today, we went one step further. We used the same methodology and did the same exercise for 2 years, and then try to see how stable these school contributions are over time, with the assumption that if it's really an effect of the school, we would expect it to be stable over time, because schools probably won't change that drastically from one year to the next. So we use data from 5 out of the 8 core districts, including Fresno, Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Santa Ana. And we used the scale scores that Sean had mentioned for the years 14, 15, 15, 16, and 16, 17, and use these scale scores for each of the 4 constructs that we've already heard about. And then in addition, we will do the same exercise for math and ELA as assessed by the Smarter Balance assessment, to have basically a more established academic measure to compare our results from SEL against. And then I go quickly through measures because Sean has already done a really great job of explaining this. We'll estimate these value-added models by grade for each and by year for 2015 and 16, 16, 17 for the 4 SEL survey constructs and the 2 SBAC outcomes. We have different grades that we can do that for. For SEL, we have grades 5 through 12. And for SBAC outcomes, you only have grades 5 through 8. And then, as we've already said, that we will control for all of these outcomes in the previous year. And that really gets us to understand how did a student grow from one year to the next, and how much of this growth can be attributed to a given school. And then, because we're dealing with survey-based measures, there's a lot of potential measurement error that could go in there. So we try to correct for that as much as possible. I will not talk about this in more detail, but it is in the paper corresponding to this webinar. And then to our main research questions, the stability over time, or how much does 1 year or the school effect in 1 year predict the next one, we'll look at correlations between the same of the school effect in one grade in the same school to the same grade in the next year, and then draw conclusions of how stable these effects are. To jump right into the results, this looks at the variation of these contributions to student growth by year in a given year. So those are the differences between school, and we measure the variation of that with the standard deviation. So here, to remind you, we want variation. Variation between schools is a good thing because that can inform how we assess schools in terms of how they contribute to socio-emotional learning. And you can see math and ELA, those are the orange and the mustard colored lines as a reference point. So they start at relatively high in earlier grades and then somewhat plateau in middle school and high school. And we see that that's pretty much the same for the SEL survey measures, or the school effects for SEL. So that's already somewhat encouraging, that we see the variation that we can that we get with these models for these school effects is about the same. And next we turn then to whether, now that we have established that there is variation between schools, how stable are these effects from 1 year to the next? So we look here at correlations, and they're the regular ones and ones for measurement error corrected ones, but they're pretty much the same. So just pick one of the panels, and we see, and the correlation basically measures how much two measures move in the same direction. So if school effects in 1 year behave or move in exactly the same way as school effects in the next year, then we would have a correlation of 1. And if there is no relation, they basically kind of move completely unrelated, then we'd have a correlation of 0. So we see that the correlation is relatively high for math and ELA. That's the first two columns. It's like peaks in grade 6 and then kind of like flat decreases a little bit. If we look at the measures, the correlations for school effects on SEL, we see that these effects are positive and significant, as indicated by the shaded confidence band is larger than 0, but they're smaller. So than what we see for math and ELA. So this is, and the exceptions are here, self-efficacy in grade 9, and then social awareness a little bit in grade 7 and 9. But overall, the level seems a little lower. And that is, on one hand, like we see some evidence because it's positive. So like what happens in 1 year predicts how much schools contribute in the next year, which is evidence of that we probably measure true school effects. However, there is a lot that's left unexplained from 1 year to the next. And then as a final exercise, we wanted to understand, does this stability differ based on how high or how low these school effects are? So what we did is basically, in both of the years that we did this exercise for, we ranked all the students according to their contribution to SEL, and then divided them into quarters. And then the first quarter is 25% of the lowest schools with the lowest contribution, and the quarter 4 is the 25% of the highest. With the schools with the highest contribution. And then the diagonal, you basically see what that would indicate the schools that didn't move from 1 year to the next, that stayed in the same position as indicated by these quarters. And these numbers show is how much what's the percentage points difference in the schools that place in each of these quadrants in respect or relative to what we would have expected if it was a completely unrelated process from 1 year to the next. So that would be 6.25%. So this is the difference. So if it's 0 or close to 0, this difference, then in these parts of the distribution, stability is almost as what we expect due to a random process. And we see that the middle two quarters, that it's almost as if the first, like what happened in year one didn't really affect what happened in year two. But if we go to the bottom and the top quarter, we see that there are significantly more schools in these quarters than what we would have expected if it was just a random or like a process due to chance. And that indicates that this correlation that we see, this positive correlation, is mostly attributable to very high and very low performing schools, which suggests that we can still that we can use these measures to identify very low and very high performing schools. Those schools that are consistently adding to students' development, and those that don't do as much. And that's pretty much the same for all of the four constructs. And then, so to wrap up with what we've learned from these exercises is that we do have evidence that these school value added measures capture real contributions. I mean, we cannot say that for certain, but it is a further piece in the puzzle that we see these positive correlations and that they're significant. However, we do see that even though there is some continuity, a lot of what happens from one year to the next is not explained for. And that could either mean that schools just don't have the same effects over years, and that could be because schools usually do not explicitly teach to SEL as they do to math and ELA. But there's another reason why that could be, and that's more of a technical kind, is that because we have these survey measures, and once we try to take out the school effect, we incur measurement error that kind of introduces a lot of variance. For instance, it could be that environmental factors such as the weather of the day of this survey or some other school-specific current events influence test taking, and then that kind of introduces variation that kind of hides the true school effect, and that might be what is happening here. And then what does that mean for us as for policy and practice and research? One is that we want more research and to really understand where the low stability is coming from and whether we can measure more stable school effects for other measures-based SEL measures that might not necessarily be survey-based. With these results, given that there is a lot of instability from one year to the next, we wouldn't recommend using these school measures, school growth measures on SEL for high stakes decision-making or accountability, just because it seems there's a lot in these effects that seems out of the control of the school. So we wouldn't want to like attach high rewards or penalties to those. But we do find that we have these like consistently high and low performing schools, and if we manage to identify those over time, we can actually learn, or that could provide a basis or a foundation for learning about what these schools might be doing differently that helps them to have more consistent positive impacts on their students' growth and in SEL. And finally, this research, this kind of skepticism about whether we should use this for high stakes measurement doesn't mean that we shouldn't use or measure SEL at large, as we've seen that, or as cores using the SEL levels and to inform and identify students that are struggling or in need of support, or schools that are in need of support, that provides still a lot of actionable information that should be approached and used. And with this, I can conclude and encourage questions at the end, and I'll hand over to our practitioner reflections.
Just quickly before we hand it off for reflections, and we're expecting that Jennifer and Jim will provide some of the insights that I know we're seeing come through on the Q&A and in the chat about use. One data question came up, Hans, that I think might be useful to discuss before we get to that, which is why the subset of data from the core districts and why the other 3 core districts data isn't part of the study?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. The other 3 districts don't measure SEL at the same way or are not able to connect it to other student data that we're using in this study. So it's really a practical decision. There's no a priori selection of school districts. Really, we were working with what was available for the model that we were using.
And then just one other question specifically about the research, and is how the study and the method accounts for variance across classrooms within schools, or if you could speak to that, Hans.
Yes, that's a great question. So what we don't really account for well, I don't have a slide on this. We don't really account for the variance across classrooms. We have to think about, if we look at the school effect, that's basically an average effect of everything that's going on at the school level. And that could be also like all the different classrooms. So if classrooms, if there's a lot of variation between the classrooms, the school effect might actually be relatively low, or there might not be as much variation. And we see that's a study that's coming out at the end of the year where we actually more explicitly try to look at school classroom variation and how they contribute to growth, where there's more variation explained through classrooms than just through the school level.
Right. So good question, and stay tuned on that. We'll have much more information about that very soon. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Bourgeois. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, Jennifer, who's the Director of Research Evaluation and School Improvement at Corona Norco Unified.
Thank you, Heather. I'm excited to be here and share some of the work that we've been doing in Corona Norco. With regards to the use of the core and the collaboration within the core collaborative, we are really embarking on this idea of the improvement science. So really looking at the data and being able to see where are we seeing pockets of success and growth and be able to learn from those schools. Further, it's helping our schools to go down this journey of looking at a root cause analysis and finding out where are the problems. Because as educators, we know going back to when I was in the classroom, we would try to figure out why is a student not being successful. And so really digging down into what is that problem and creating a culture where it's okay to say the word problem, and it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing because it'll reveal where we can grow and learn. And so when we look at some of the data that comes out of the core collaborative, we can see gaps. So one of the areas we've looked at with regards to equity is our special ed population, and being able to see how is our overall student group performing relative to a specific subgroup. And I know with all of our work across the state with regards to equity, looking at these gaps and learning from them is going to help us as a system to move forward. This year in particular, we took one pilot school and we started embarking upon how do we use the SEL data to further support that work, because we know as educators that if we want students to be successful, we can't think about them in isolation with regards to just their academic. They come to us as they're a human being. And so understanding those SEL components is incredibly valuable and important for us. We are only in year 2 of deploying and using the data, but what we have found in conversations with the teachers, and specifically it's a middle school, and that's interesting with relation to the data that you and your team have presented, where as a trend, we have challenges at the middle school. And so that presents some additional wonderings, but I digress. As we look at that 7th and 8th grade data and wondering why are we seeing a dip in growth mindset, yet we are seeing an increase in social awareness. And then peeling back that layer to have conversations with teachers specifically with relation to math, because those are 2 areas that students are not necessarily being successful in math, and they have a low growth mindset. So having that wondering around why is that, and how do we help support that growth mindset piece with the kids, and at the same time create a conversation within the teachers around just how are they engaging and interacting with the students. Those are some of the things that we have encountered and explored this year. And we're already seeing preliminary information around growth with the students in their belief in themselves and on the academic side.
Great. Thank you so much for your reflections. What would you think you might do with an analysis like this if it were produced into something operational that you could use in your district?
One of the pieces that I think would be helpful is to learn from another organization that has similar demographics. Let's say we were to take that pilot school that we were looking at, and we were to be able to see that a school that is similar in demographics, and I'm not just talking about the student demographics, I'm also talking about the teachers. So looking at what are the experiences that the teachers have coming to the table, what are the background knowledge that they have, because they are truly a key factor to student achievement. So being able to look at those features and learn from them to be able to help put those in practice to help support growth for the students at that school in particular. And then I really think it's important to look at things in a small scale and then figure that out first before you can scale it up, especially with a district our size. It would be important to start with a small group to be able to look at and explore and learn.
Great. Thank you so much. Jim, let's turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Pleased to be here, the opportunity to share our current story. We have been working similar time frame to Corona Norco with the Core Data Collaborative. This is also our second year of collecting social emotional learning data. We've been a little bit more aggressive in some of our rolling out, taking a very focused point of view on continuous improvement and making sure that we're able to identify teams, resources, structures that are moving forward and really helping our students to be successful. On the academic side, where this core growth measure is already in place, we're able to identify teams, schools, groups that have had a good deal of success in moving students forward in an impactful way. And the idea behind a similar growth indicator for social emotional learning is very appealing to us. Even using the current research to show that, there are some schools or some places that are impactful in a significant way or in a less significant way gets us an idea of then looking in and diving in a little deeper with some anecdotal, analysis or looking at practices in place at those locations to see if there is something that can be teased out or learned from common pieces. We've been very focused on our SEL components and making that as accessible to as many of our staff as possible. Our counselor group uses it very heavily. Our site administrative group uses it in more of a broader scale, and our teachers have access to the SEL information for their students. So they're able to take a look and make plans regarding how they might be able to address some need areas that may arise once they start looking at that information. We're really focused more on the self-efficacy component in that conversation. Looking at our data, we see that where we see higher self-efficacy scores, we tend to see higher results in mathematics, especially in looking at things like the distance from standard that's used for accountability. So really starting those conversations around how can we build student self-efficacy, their understanding that they can make a difference moving forward with work and with effort and being successful at challenging structures. I think for us, the other piece really involves looking at how can we build in strategies and structures where we can explicitly teach some of these skills becomes important. So how can we take the learnings that are coming from research? How can we take the components that we see as indicating that the school is having success or is being able to move forward with impactfully affecting students' SEL ratings, and what strategies can be culled from there that may be able to be either duplicated or modified and expanded upon. I think that's really our long range practice with looking at this information over more time. the study itself looks at about 3 years of data. We're looking at 2 years, so we still are early in the game, I think, in making some of these final deductions. But knowing the impacts of where we're seeing good growth, where we're seeing those pieces expand, and also taking into consideration something that was mentioned about the culture and climate involved. We know that the current depictions of school safety around the country have really been varied quite a bit. And so how does that play into some of these components is a question that we would have moving forward. So we see great promise in this effort, and we look forward to seeing continued research and seeing how the partnerships with the Core Data Collaborative, with PACE, and with our fellow network can further the successes of our students. So thank you for allowing us to be here today.
Thank you so much, particularly to Jim and Jennifer, for those reflections. Some of our questions are specifically about social emotional learning and how we think about implementing that within schools, and especially schools that are very diverse, versus both in terms of how they serve, their size, the population of educators that exist within them. One question that was raised is, how in your districts are you thinking about self-care for adults or educators, or the concept of social emotional learning for the adults that serve children? Is that something that comes into the work that you're doing?
I'll speak to the context of Palm Springs. We conduct school climate surveys with our teachers as well, and take a look at not just the teaching staff, but also the other staff that is at the school site, and making sure that they're feeling supported from a cultural aspect. We currently don't do social emotional learning measures with that group. However, we do have available resources within our district to be able to connect staff with some of those supports that may be able to help with those pieces. Part of building the awareness of what these measures mean and how they can support students, I think, has a maybe unintended benefit for the teachers and the school staff as well, as they're concentrating on what are these SEL measures, how do they indicate success within students, also may involve some self-reflection on their part as to how they're supporting those efforts. So I see that as being an impactful piece in making sure that they're also getting what they need to be successful in these endeavors.
And on behalf of Corona Norco, our instructional support division works extensively to extend out the supports that exist for the adults within the district through our leadership work. There is an expectation, if you will, or a promotion around the idea of taking care of oneself, because we can't take care of oneself. If we can't take care of oneself, then we are not going to be our best to take care of the people that we serve, whether it's the students, the teachers, whatever role we're in. And so the work starting with our superintendent and going to all facets, it is this belief about taking care of oneself and looking at that social emotional piece. With regards to the growth mindset, I know that there are some districts that have done some work in the direction of using DWEC's work very solid and focused. We have done parts of that through various pieces, not specifically quoting DWEC's work, but it is infused in the work that we do. But that's part of I think the growth and opportunity in the years to come with using the SEL data as it relates to students, but also adults.
Sorry, thank you so much. So some of our other questions, and I'll open this up to other panelists now, are around issues of measurement and use and where those pieces intersect. So the first question in this realm is about how these different constructs are related. And Jennifer, you touched a little bit on some of the differences between constructs or approaches, but our research has shown that these SEL constructs that core measures are related but separate. And some of them are more similar than others. So for example, this comment is that self-efficacy and growth mindset seem like two concepts that are very closely related. How should we, or do we in our research, think about approaching those different things differently? Hans, perhaps you or someone at EA? Okay, great.
Yeah, sure. So the measurement work that we've done, sorry, this is Libby Peer with Education Analytics. You've been staring at my name on our camera here. So the measurement work that we've done here, as Heather mentioned, has shown, we look at what's called the interscale correlation, which is what is the correlation between the four constructs across grades, or we can look at it at each grade level. And generally they are moderately correlated between maybe 0.6 and 0.7 or a little bit larger. And it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in that you want these things to be somewhat related to each other because they measure related kinds of competencies, but of course you don't want them to be too related to each other because that implies that they are in fact redundant or not easily distinguishable. Some of our really recent research has suggested that that also might be different if you're thinking about student level competencies versus school level competencies. So for instance, if you're asking students to self-report on their belief about their self-efficacy or their belief about their own growth mindset, a student might be able to better differentiate what growth mindset is versus what self-efficacy is. But once you start to average that up to the school level, that might actually become less useful to differentiate growth mindset versus self-efficacy. And it might in fact be more useful to think about SEL more broadly. So we're still doing some work to really dig into what that means for intervention or for reporting. And I think it's generally something that many in the field of SEL are still grappling with. How do we conceptualize and operationalize what SEL is? What are the right competencies or constructs to be measuring and for what purposes?
Great, thank you so much, Libby. That was really helpful. Rick, I'm going to address this next question to you because it's a broader question around the politics of data and measurement. We as a field, especially teachers and educators, have had some maybe bad experiences with value-added models in the past. And so how is what the work that you're doing around school impact modeling, both on academic outcomes, but also on social emotional outcomes, how are you thinking about that as a collaborative and ways to overcome some of that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So in terms of growth or value add, I mean, I think the key to me is what you're trying to get and how you're using it. And I think that's where it differentiates from an NCLB era. The notion of growth, of the impact a school has on the students in the school is critically important. We've been a strong supporter with the state of actually we think change is not a great measure to consider in the state's accountability measure because you're looking at one cohort of kids versus another one and it doesn't really tell you much other than maybe the kids changed. Or if you can actually look at how you impacted an individual student, it will tell you much more from a how you respond perspective. If you're doing it to punish the school, to put them into program improvement, to tell them how they're wrong, you've done no good. And I think that's unfortunately where that sort of negativity towards value add has come from. The other, quite frankly, controversy and difficult thing was using it in teacher evaluation. That is not what we're attempting to do. We have no interest in doing that. And I think that is where it sort of went off the rails. So if you're using it to evaluate or promote or discipline a teacher, it's not the right use of that data. But if you're using it to understand the impact you're having on schools and use it to then change what you're doing and to intervene where you need to or learn from others who are doing it well, we think it's a very appropriate use of this data. And that's sort of what the area we're trying to push.
Great. Thank you. Any reflections from Jim and Jennifer on the use of these types of measures within schools and within your district, given some of the history?
As I mentioned before, we take that improvement mindset pretty heavily. And really the way, the way that we framed SEL measures, growth measures, academic, what have you, is really around how can we improve our students' experience, how can we improve outcomes for the students that we serve. We've been able to keep that conversation focused away from an evaluative point and more towards a flashlight perspective of how can we identify things that could be improved and how can we work towards doing that. And so I think that the more that becomes part of the conversation, the more that is the focus of the discussion, the more successful folks can be in removing the stigma that that type of measure may have.
And I would have to echo that as well. I mentioned earlier about identifying a problem and having it not be viewed as a negative thing is so important. It's changing a culture and a mindset from the adults in the room, and really having it be viewed as a wondering. You'll hear the teachers and the administrators across the district say, "Oh, Jennifer has a wondering." Well, it is because it's about the wondering of the data and what does that tell us, and then it leads to more questions to peel back either the layer of the onion, or as one of my colleagues mentioned the other day, a pomegranate, because this work is messy. And it's messy, but it's the right work, and it's good work, because it will truly impact students being able to achieve whatever goal it is that they want to. And so setting that stage and that culture around it's okay to ask questions and to wonder and to dig deeper. And so that, I think, is the biggest challenge in education up and down the state, because we were so entrenched in a different culture before. Around the data. So it's, we have to give ourselves grace and time, but at the same time, there's an urgency because the kids that are sitting in front of us deserve it.
I do think that's also important to know. I really appreciate that from Jennifer. And I think it's important as we're doing this work with continuous learning with our districts, you find the state has done a good job in reorienting accountability and making it multiple measures and thinking differently about the consequences. But even with the state making decisions, there's a culture that is embedded in our systems about summative assessments, about the importance, about the use of data, and about it from sort of an NCLB perspective. And that's going to take time, energy, and a lot of focus to overcome. And so there's a lot of work to be done on behalf, beyond just the state making a change, for all of us to think about changing culture of how we use data in our schools.
Absolutely. So our final question here, and then we'll wrap up, is around how we should be thinking about the use of measures with really diverse kinds of sites and really diverse kinds of students served. So the examples that this questioner posed are alternative schools or continuation schools, juvenile halls, community day schools. When we're thinking about measurement generally, how do you at CORE and in the districts think about accounting with measures for these different kinds of sites? And then, and so I'll pose that question first to CORE, and then to the education analytics team. Any thoughts about SEL measures and how we should be accounting for those different school sites or using them in the different school sites? So first, CORE.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. This is Dave Calhoun here with the group. And I think I would just want to begin by describing or mentioning that, the approach that we've taken so far has been to create a measure that's useful and valuable to the degree that it can be for all schools. So we do have a lot of schools that are participating in our districts that are alternative schools or continuation schools. And to have that general measure is a valuable piece for any kind of school. And yet it's really important to also consider kind of the unique contexts that schools are in, not just the kind of school, but even the places that schools are in, and the kind of setting that the schools are in. And to that degree, it really becomes important for schools and districts to think about what are some other ways, possibly more tailored to the unique student populations that make up schools, or the geographical location of the schools, or even grade levels. And so we want to really encourage schools and districts to be thinking about other ways of measuring and other opportunities to be getting a sense of where kids are at, and to really be able to tailor and customize that. So we've even thought about the possibility of moving in the direction of trying to provide some more resources, not just within CORE, but really be thinking about opportunities to do more formative approaches to seeing where kids are at in terms of SEL, specific to subjects, specific to different points in time, different points in their careers. So that's a fertile area, I think, to be exploring.
The other thing I don't know if I can turn our EA friends, I know we're running out of time, Heather, is that to me, this is the entire point of growth. This is why you make this effort to understand growth. And if you're looking at just overall SEL skills and comparing a comprehensive high school to a continuation, you're obviously going to get very different results. It's not going to tell you a whole lot of anything. But if we actually get growth right, we can figure out a way to do this, understand your impact on those kids, and you factor in the difficulty, kids that struggle they've had, and kids that are often in the schools, then you can actually have actionable data to work with. And I think that's why we're going through this effort, and appreciate this study and appreciate the work we're doing.
That was mostly right in line with what I was going to say, so thank you, Rick. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your reflections. Thank you to the panelists, particularly to Jim and Jennifer, for joining us and sharing your perspectives, and all of the attendees. We'll send out the slides from these presentations, as well as the recent reports, and a link to the full set of studies that we as a collaborative group of researchers have been doing on course SEL measures. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you learned some new stuff.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.